The military mind abhors nothing more than uncertainty, a lack of discipline, and a lack of a clear chain of command.
I've had a good relationship with President Erdogan. And because of the fact he bought a Russian missile, we're not allowed to sell him billions of dollars worth of aircraft. It's not a fair situation.
Hello and welcome to G0 World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today I've got a big show for you. I'm talking Trump, I'm talking Turkey, and I'm talking about why the song Hotel California helps to explain NATO. You can check out, but you can never leave. After 67 years, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is threatening to do just that, checking out and never leaving. And so to help me sort all this out, we have a man who was once NATO's Supreme Allied Commander. I'm talking about former four-star Admiral James Stavridis. And of course, I've also got your puppet regime.
This is the ground force de l'espace. Do you think you have the right to stuff or not?
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. What do Turkey, ballistic weapon systems, and ice cream all have in common? One word: Moscow. It must have been rocky road, because that's what's in store for the Turkish president after he not only asked Vladimir Putin to buy him an ice cream cone, but also agreed to have Russia provide him with a new S-400 missile defense system. The reason why that's a big deal has to do with history. The US has been delivering Turkey's ice cream, and with good humor, for generations. I'm sorry about that. It's a frontline state in NATO, an alliance between the US, Canada, and Europe, whose original purpose was to create a defense pact against possible Soviet aggression. So now, Mr. Erdogan, you're eating Putin's froyo, and you think the US will be okay with that?
He wanted to buy the Patriot missile. President Obama's group said no, couldn't buy it. Now, he needed it for defense. So he then went to Russia, and he bought the S-400. I'm all for our country, but he got treated very unfairly.
Okay, that wasn't exactly a condemnation. It wasn't even all that accurate. Under President Obama, the US sought to sell Turkey the Patriot air defense system, but Erdogan also wanted the plans to build them himself. Obama said no, and then Erdogan eventually ended up at a Moscow air show. The purpose of that little meeting, by the way, was so that President Putin could show off his latest fighter jets. Why, you ask? Well, after a swell of internal pressure, the Trump administration said it wouldn't allow Turkey to buy its stealth warplane, the F-35, because Russian technology could be used to spy on America's preeminent fighter jet.
Much of the F-35 strength lies in its stealth capabilities, so the ability to detect those capabilities would jeopardize the long-term security of the F-35 program.
With America out of the picture and Russian jets for sale, the ice cream man cometh. Why does it all matter? Resulting U.S. sanctions against Ankara will undermine Turkey's economy. That matters. It's already in the throes of recession. The bigger point is that these are supposed to be allies. Turkey joined NATO in 1951 to help the U.S. provide collective security against Moscow. Now, even though they're still a member, that's hardly a mission priority. Times are changing. And it's not exactly the same Turkey either, whose politics are no longer dominated by a military concerned with Soviet aggression. Instead, under Erdogan, the nation now leads the world in the numbers of jailed journalists. And its lean away from democracy has essentially abolished term limits in the country. Turkish priorities in Syria are also at odds with anyone who supports the Kurds, like the United States, a group that's been among the most effective in fighting ISIS. And now, despite having signed a bunch of non-proliferation treaties, President Erdogan says he'd like to go nuclear.
Birilerinin elinde nükleer başlıklı füze var. Bir tane iki tane değil. Ama benim elimde nükleer başlıklı füze olmasın. Ben bunu kabul etmiyorum.
This isn't how the alliance was set up to work, right? It's also not exactly the same United States as it was back when NATO was first created in 1949. There are even reports that Trump has discussed pulling America out of NATO altogether, a move that would effectively destroy the 70-year-old alliance. I'm not buying it. I think that's just spurious rumor. But the problem is that, like what the United Kingdom is experiencing with Brexit, NATO never established a way for any countries to leave. To help me sort this out is a man who led the NATO alliance and its global operations for more than 4 years. Please welcome Admiral James Stavridis.
It depends on the scenario.
When we do that as an outtake,
Yeah.
it's gonna be awesome.
Yeah, it's not particularly well known.
And I have Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Good to be with you, Jim.
You say that very well. Thank you.
Do I? I feel like you have to run that introduction up the flagpole.
You have no idea how many different alternative mentions there are, from Supreme Commander to Allied Commander Supreme to El Supremo. It's just
Have you
all over
gotten
the map.
Supreme Leader?
No, but I encourage my wife to call me Supremo at home.
Supremo.
It's not working.
Yeah, you need a cigar for that, I think.
Indeed.
That's correct. Well, okay, let's not go there. And instead, let's talk about what the hell is happening in the world. Our friend, Mr. Erdogan, president of Turkey, has taken possession of this Russian S-400 system. I mean, I'm starting with that because since you ran NATO, this feels like an indictment of that alliance. Is it?
I think in the mind of President Erdogan, he is very tired of being told what to do by NATO, by the United States in particular. And he's a very prideful man. I got to know him reasonably well when he was prime minister and I was Supreme Allied Commander. He sees Turkey as not a bridge between East and West, Ian, but a center of power unto itself. And he feels Turkey is not sufficiently respected. All of that collides with his concerns about U.S. support to Kurds in Syria, as well as this nagging sense of rejection Turkey continues to feel about not being allowed to join the European
EU as a full member.
Right. So
the candidate member.
Where this comes out is President Erdogan, if he were in this chair, would say, so I am looking for other mechanisms to help create security for my nation, hence I purchased this system. It's not a completely illogical position, but the problem is that when he buys this system, Ian, it is going to be plugged into the NATO integrated air defense.
Right.
And who knows what kind of cyber honeypots and backdoors and intelligence collection mechanisms are in it.
I mean, it's got to be inconceivable that if it's a Russian system, the data wouldn't be going back to Russia, right?
It indeed. Now, there is still some movement from the Turkish side to say, we can isolate it, we can quarantine the system electronically, we can clean and sweep it. I don't think that's going to stand up to technical scrutiny. So at the end of the day, we have a real collision here. Now, where will it go? I think on the spectrum that runs from we all just shrug our shoulders and say, hey, we'll just kind of live with this, to Turkey bails out of the alliance or is asked to leave the alliance, it's kind of parked in the middle. The sanction will be the withdrawal of the J-35 Joint Strike Fighters. The stealth fighter. And I think there'll be blowback from the Turks when we do that. How that manifests remains to be seen.
So you said that this is something that the Turks feel, that Erdogan feels is important to his defense. I mean, you know what this system does, this missile defense system. Is it actually important to Turkey's defense?
There are alternatives which would work just as well. And I'll give you one. It's the Patriot missile system made here in the United States. There are Israeli, as you know very well, air defense systems that are as capable as the S-400.
The Iron Dome system.
Yeah, built out the Arrow.
Raytheon,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So there are many alternatives. And so the argument that Erdogan had to go to this particular system really doesn't hold water.
So what he's saying is not really credible from your perspective.
I do not think it is. However, this is a case where the United States, I think, needs to broaden this conversation from a U.S. versus Turkey kind of confrontation get the alliance engaged in this. There are 29 nations in the alliance, soon to be 30 when North Macedonia joins.
Right.
Let's build this into an alliance-wide conversation, and let's try and find a climb down for Turkey on this that would make some sense.
So if you were in charge of NATO right now, how much flexibility, I mean, absent because you're saying it's the United States that needs to orchestrate, what could the Supreme Allied Commander do proactively, given this administration, given the challenges that the alliance presently has, to try to bring Erdogan back into the fold and reduce the tensions that we see?
Yeah, I would start, if I were Supreme Allied Commander, I would call the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, and say, how about if I go to Ankara and let me have a meeting with the senior Turkish military? And in particular, I would focus on former General Hulusi Akar, who is now the Minister of Defense, the Jim Mattis model. Speaks perfect English, studied in England, very polished in all his interactions, has Erdogan's trust and confidence. I think he would be the place to take the conversation and do it at a military to military kind of way and say to the minister, let's find a way to solve this problem. And so I think those kind of personal contacts could be helpful. Number two, we ought to broaden the conversation beyond just air defense. We ought to be talking to the Turks about, let's look at your defenses as a package, as part of the alliance. Maybe there are other systems, other ways we can work with you to build those out. And thirdly, we ought to look for, as I mentioned before, are there technical fixes we can take? So let's create a working group of the top minds in the alliance to take a look at the system, take a ground-based look at it, and see if we can solve this thing. And by the way, before we simply kick the Turks out of the Joint Strike Fighter program, I would say, let's not announce that we're sanctioning them and throwing them out. Let's put it on hold while we take a good hard look at the technical, while we have these conversations, individual to individual, and while we broaden Turkey's remit in the alliance by looking at their defenses holistically.
Now, assuming that we were to do those things, do you think that the U.S. separately, it is appropriate to put sanctions on the Turks for taking these steps? Certainly, members of Congress, members of the administration have been warning them about those steps. Erdogan he's delayed, but now he's formally ignored that.
Right.
Does that require the Americans to take that step?
I would say not quite yet, but I can see that step from where I'm standing right now. And of course, what you're referring to is the 2017 legislation countering America's adversaries with sanctions.
Cat's up.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right.
I think it's probably not quite time to impose those sanctions. Let's do the things I mentioned first. If we have to, then yes, I think it would be time to engage
A matter
those
of
sanctions.
months, you're
talking.
talking.
Yeah, months, not years. Certainly.
Absolutely. I get you. Okay. Now, we've been talking, you and I, but also broadly, about existential questions around NATO, its purpose, its mission. And this isn't new. It's ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. And not all that much has happened in response to those conversations. How do you think about where NATO is as an organization today, its utility, its purpose?
Sure. I often get this question, as in, well, why are we still in this Cold War relic of an organization? Let me just give you a handful of things really swiftly. Values. This is the greatest pool of partners we have in the world where they all share our values: democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute them imperfectly and unevenly across the alliance, but it is a pool of partners that share our values. Secondly, geography. Europe is parked on the western edge of the Eurasian continent, effectively in between the United States and Asia. It's terrific geopolitical real estate. People would say to me, well, do we really need those Cold War bases? Those aren't Cold War bases. Those are the forward operating stations of the 21st century. This geography matters. Thirdly, the alliance itself, its wealth, its resources. This is 29 nations, 52% of the world's GDP, 3 million people under arms, almost all volunteers, 800 ocean-going aircraft, 24,000 military aircraft. You get the idea. The alliance outspends Russia and China 6-1. them combined. We outspend Russia 12 to 1. So it is an enormous trove of value here, and about a third of it comes from Europe. And then finally, Ian, it's the experiences that we have shared in all of these operations since the end of the Cold War. We have cadres of warriors who have fought together in Afghanistan, Libya, the Balkans, Syria, Iraq. In all those places, we had NATO missions, counter-piracy at sea. That experience base makes this a very relevant alliance for security going forward. So I think there's still a very strong case to be made for NATO.
And no question, the U.S. and NATO together spend vast amounts of money on all of this defense capabilities, and interoperability matters, and training matters, and morale matters. How much has it hurt that NATO's mission in Afghanistan has been so sapping of morale?
Yeah.
Has been so expensive?
Yeah.
Has gone on for so long?
Yeah.
Does that really erode NATO capabilities, NATO mission?
From a military perspective, the mission in Afghanistan has actually been salutary for NATO capabilities because it has provided a unified effort together. Under my command, for example, 150,000 NATO troops, 100,000 US, 50,000 from the rest of the alliance. And all of that has built into the alliance a real sense of ethos. Now, whether or not that mission ends successfully, to be seen. My guess is 2 in 3 chance it will end successfully, as in like almost every insurgency, it'll end in a negotiated settlement. It'll look
With the Taliban.
with the Taliban. I think it'll look a lot like Colombia, as in instead of the FARC coming into government in Colombia, you'll see Taliban coming into government in Afghanistan. We're right on the knife's edge with that
And you'll still see a lot of
negotiation.
remobilization going
You
on.
certainly will, and we all ought to stop and say thank you, Ambassador Zal Khalilzad, good friend to both of us, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations,
Now
U.S.
Special
Ambassador to
Envoy.
Afghanistan, Special Envoy. If he didn't exist, would have to invent him to solve this problem. And I think there's, like I say, a 2 in 3 chance this comes out negotiated settlement. Still a 1 in 3 chance the wheels could come off, and it looks very ugly at the back end. But I think this is going to be more Colombia, less Vietnam when the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam.
Another NATO question is, with all of the money on conventional military capabilities, you hear from the NSA and others that the Russians and the Americans are almost at parity in terms of cyber capabilities. Now, NATO talks about cyber an awful lot, but really hard to know how to engage in that asymmetric type of battle. And so much of what we're talking about is asymmetric. We hear about the Chinese talking about space. Again, not exactly where NATO is heading right now.
Yeah.
We have our Space Force, the French now announcing they want their Space Force. Does that necessarily erode NATO's capabilities over the medium term?
I don't think so. If you look at the last 5 years in particular, NATO has made extremely aggressive efforts to up its game in cyber. As you know, we have the Cyber Security Center in Tallinn, Estonia. Pretty appropriate. They've been attacked repeatedly by the Russians. And the leading NATO cyber countries, United States, Great Britain, France, some degree Germany is not terrible in this space, are working together more and more to share ideas, to trade information. We're not quite exposing our full package of tools, and I don't think we will. But over time, Ian, I think you'll see cyber weapons treated the way nuclear weapons are in the alliance. Britain has them, France has them, the United States has them. There'll be a set of those nukes that are effectively apportioned to NATO. And so you'll see those cyber tools, I think, gravitate in that direction over time. Not there yet. NATO's aware of it and moving appropriately.
Now, if that's the way that we're going to eventually handle cyber weapons, and obviously cyber weapons are unlike nukes in the sense that we do engage in offensive use of those weapons all the time.
Right.
Do you believe that we will see combined cyber offensive capabilities that will come from NATO?
I do. And in fact, we have a role model, if you will, and it's not a good one. It's the invasion of Georgia in 2008 by Russia.
By the Russians.
That will go down in military history as the first time that there was a combined cyber attack with kinetic bombs, rockets, troops, tanks. It won't be the last. And in fact, every conflict going forward is going to have a cyber component to it. You are correct that now we use them in a kind of a tactical context, and President Trump, I think, correctly reached for a cyber weapon
against Iran.
After the attacks on the tankers.
John Bolton said we were opening the aperture on cyber offensive capabilities.
Indeed.
Did it scare you when he said that?
No, it really doesn't. I think that we need to understand, however, that at the far end of that aperture are society-busting kinds of cyber tools that can permanently damage, for example, an electric grid. That would be comparable to the use of nuclear weapons in many scenarios. We're not there yet. We don't, in my view, want that aperture to open wide and start reaching for those kind of tools on the mistaken assumption that, well, we're not knocking down buildings and therefore this isn't as bad as a nuclear weapon. So that regime that has kept us from using nuclear weapons of deterrence has yet to be constructed in the cyber world.
We're talking a lot about NATO. We haven't talked much about America. We don't have a Secretary of Defense. But we are told that it is not changing the operations, the management, the functioning of the DoD at all. Is that right for you? Is that credible?
No, I find that not credible as an explanation. And for starters, the uniformed military looking up toward a civilian chain of command appropriately. You know, the military mind abhors nothing more than uncertainty, a lack of discipline, and a lack of a clear chain of command. So there's a problem internally as our uniformed military kind of says, who's really running the joint? And then secondly, our allies kind of don't know who to pick up the phone and call, because is this person going to be there 3 weeks from now? What's the remit of the job? And then thirdly, our opponents look at it with glee because they feel as though there's got to be confusion and missteps. And we all know this, whether you're running 1 million people at NATO or 2 million people in the U.S. Department of Defense, if you don't have clear, consistent people who are in place for a relatively long period of time, efficiency goes down. So we ought to be concerned. Having said all that, the institution will weather this.
Now, morale issue on that side, functionality issue on that side. On the other hand, Obama administration period, defense budgets shrinking.
Yeah.
Trump administration period, defense budgets so far expanding. How much is that affecting morale on the other side?
It's positive. And let's face it, military people have strong ideas and they want a strong level of national defense. So certainly there's been a morale upswing in the military. And if you look at polling of the military, you'll find significant support for President Trump. On the other hand, military people do not like a lot of change and uncertainty. Many were disappointed at the departure of General Secretary Jim Mattis. I think that right now, the best thing the Trump administration could do would be to settle out on the team in the Pentagon, get them in place, show confidence in them. That would go a long way toward righting the uncertainty of the moment.
Admiral James Stavridis, if I wasn't a civilian, I'd salute you. And now for something completely different, I've got your puppet regime.
In order to boost enlistment in the new French Space Force, we have decided to take a new approach. This is the grande force de l'espace. Do you think you have the right stuff or not? To give a French kiss to all of the stars, to build the best boulangerie upon Mars. The grande force de l'espace, the destination galaxy, let's take our shot. Who knows where this unlikely mission will take us? Versailles in the sky, certain glory awaits us. The grande force de l'espace, we're blasting off and lifting off, ready or not. To leave behind Earth, it's become so passé. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, we go up and away. blast off and lift off and blast off and lift off and blast off and lift off. Do you think you have the gall to suit up and come join this gall? On a bon voyage to trompe them all. On a bon voyage to trompe them all.
That's our show this week. We'll be back next week. Don't miss it. Please don't miss it. I mean, I like it when you come back. I mean, it creates a tradition. It's weekly. It's good. In the meantime, if you like what you've seen, check us out on gzeromedia.com.